Hello, this is Tim from Vintage RC Garage. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the Tamiya Frog and compare the vintage 5841 new in box against the re-release 58354 new in box. The Frog was released in December of 1983 and was last produced in 1988. It was the third of the ORV chassis after the Subaru Brat and the Lancia Rally. The Frog was re-released in 2005. This is my second vintage versus re-release deep dive, so I'm getting a little better clarity on the common differences. One thing I learned this time around is that I believe that the POM, PA, and PC stampings with the less than and greater than symbols are the place of manufacturing stamps. One of my YouTube subscribers mentioned that the PC means it was built in the Philippines from Cebu. I am not sure about POM and PA designations, but my guess would also be Philippines locations. Okay, now let's get into the details. Let's start with the boxes. In the upper left, the vintage Japanese translates to 1/10 electric RC car, RS540 motor, and the Mighty Frog. The top Japanese describes the highlights of the design, the lower about the battery and radio requirements. The re-release translates to 1/10 electric RC racing buggy with 540 type motor. It also talks about the design highlights, battery, and radio requirements, but also adds more verbiage on warnings and safety. In the upper right, the buggy picture has a dual servo version in the vintage, but only a single steering servo for the re-release because of the electronic speed controller. But the biggest and always dead giveaway of a kit is a re-release is the bright orange sticker that says it includes an electronic speed controller. Moving on to the Frog box art itself. Everything there is identical except the decal differences, which I will go into later on. The largest giveaway is the KC Daylighter spot lamp covers on the vintage and the bright light spot lamp covers on the re-release. On the front edge of the box, there are a few noticeable differences. The buggy design has the servos and speed controller being different, but there are also minor differences in the driver, engine wires, and steering rods. The text in the middle has the top roughly the same, but the vintage has the bottom text also in Japanese, which talks more about the gearbox and gear ratios, whereas the re-release is in English and is an exact copy of the Japanese description. The left and right sides are almost identical. The difference on the box art is the same as the front. They both sport the Mighty Frog title on the lower right. Obviously, the dead giveaway here is the kit number 5841 versus 58354. And the difference in yen prices. On the top side of the box, there is more information. It has another diagram of the buggy without the shell. There are also minor differences between the vintage and re-release. On the vintage, the text in the middle talks about the buggy dimensions and weight, as well as some color on its off-road capability. On the bottom text, it talks about the rear damper system. On the re-release, the text contains less color, but also talks about the buggy dimensions and weight. On the bottom, however, the text is in English, not Japanese, and talks about a lot of the same things as the top. Okay, now let's jump inside the boxes to the interesting parts. The first thing you will notice when you open them up is that the two look nothing alike on the inside. The center in the vintage is the traditional blister pack top, this one in aqua, and is flanked on the left with the space frame, rims, and C-parts tree, and on the right, the body shell, driver, and decals. In the re-release, the blister pack is replaced with a burgundy box that holds almost every part, minus the rims and C-parts tree, which are on the left. The right also has the body shell, but it's missing the decals and driver and adds the electronic speed controller. Taking out the C-parts tree, you can see that these trees also have different parts and layout. The re-release tree has an extra set of parts protruding from the tree, as well as a number of parts that are missing. These parts are on the vintage tree are all parts that are listed as not used, probably from the early usage in the Subaru Brat. The markings are different as well. The vintage has the Subaru Brat stamping where the re-release has nothing and just the PC stamp instead of the Made in Japan designation. The re-release has the original 5858 Blackfoot kit number where the vintage has no part numbers at all. Lastly, the re-release has the engineering stamps in the middle. The rim part trees are laid out identically with both sets of trees in each box having the same markings. In a confusing cross usage, the vintage trees have the 1/10 RC VW Buggy 2 text to specify that the rims are the same as the racing buggy Sand Scorcher, and the re-release contains the 5816 number for the same kit. The re-release also copyrights the date as 1979, the year the Sand Scorcher was released. The ABS stamp on the re-release is replaced with the Made in Japan designation on the vintage. Be careful if you are looking at the driver parts tree. The re-release has the Tamiya 1983 and 5841 number to designate the Frog, and the 1986 and 5855 number for the Boomerang. The vintage tree only has RCC, the Frog, and the Made in Japan designation. This one shouldn't need explanation, but the re-release has the electronic speed controller packaged inside the box and the mechanical speed controller in the blister pack in the vintage. It should be very easy to recognize the difference between these two parts. As mentioned earlier, the vintage has many parts in the blister pack, whereas the re-release has everything packed inside the smaller box. This does make it very difficult to do a direct comparison, since the parts bags have a mix of bag plus blister packs on the re-release side. I will do the best I can on these bags, but they will certainly not be a complete one-to-one comparison. Okay, now that we have everything out, we can start with the most iconic part of the Frog, the base frame A-parts trees. These parts are unique because there are two A-parts trees, yet the two trees have different layouts. The re-release and vintage trees have the exact same layout and parts, but the shades of gray are slightly different, which could just be old age. The re-release has 1983 and 5838, which is the correct information for the Subaru Brat, but the vintage actually has RCC Subaru Brat and 1983 listed. The vintage also has Made in Japan, where the re-release has the ABS stamping. Other re-release only giveaways are the engineering stamping as well as the battery trash can icon. Finally, the re-release does have the Subaru Brat on it in another location where the vintage has nothing. Next up are the B and S parts tree, which are packaged together. The B parts tree on the vintage has the 8 plastic bushings, whereas those parts are in another bag in the re-release. Also, all the parts in the vintage tree that are not used by the Frog are absent from the re-release tree. Since the part list is different, the re-release uses its own 58354 number and also has the POM and engineering stamping, whereas the vintage just has RCC Subaru Brat and Made in Japan. The S parts tree are the same, although the re-release uses less parts in the build. You can still tell them apart because the re-release has the 1983 and 5841 text, whereas the vintage only has the RCC the Frog. There is also the differing manufacturing designations. The Frog had a different bumper in 1983 than the rest of the manufacturing years. I don't have an original, but my vintage has the Quattro Rally text and Made in Japan designation. The re-release just has the 1983 and 5838 for the Quattro and location and engineering stampings. There is a slight mold difference on the center brace. The vintage is a more tapered curve, whereas the re-release has a more consistent thickness. Next up, the H parts tree. One difference right off the bat is that the vintage bag is actually sealed, whereas the re-release is stapled. The re-release has 1983 Tamiya, 5336, and the PC designation. The vintage, on the other hand, has RC Subaru Brat text for the Brat and Made in Japan. Okay, so now is where things get a little harder because many of the bags had different parts. Next up is the tool bag. The things in common are the joint rubber boots, the zip ties, Allen keys, grease, and double-sided tape. Only the vintage has a switch cover, rubber bag, and bead bands, whereas the re-release only has the box wrench, sponge and glass tape, and anti-wear grease. The double antennas are pretty close to each other. The only visible difference I see is that the vintage top bend is slightly flatter, whereas the re-release has a perfectly rounded bend. Next bag is the press parts bag. There are a number of common parts in this bag, but only the vintage contains the resistor plate, resistor stay, glass plate, and the rear arm stopper. And only in the re-release contains the reinforcement plate. The motors are both 540s, but are clearly distinguishable. The re-release has the RS 540 text as well as Made in China designation. The vintage has no markings on the can. Also, if you can turn the motor on the end, you can see that the re-release is silver, whereas the vintage has a black plastic cap. The rod bags are very different. Some of these parts are in the vintage blister pack. The only parts that are only in the vintage bag are the 45 and 55 millimeter servo rods, On the other hand, the re-release bag only has spacers, 21 48mm shafts, O-rings, body mount, adjuster rod, and the motor plate. The next bag up is the drive parts bag. There is no bag for this in the vintage kit since these parts come in the top of the blister pack. Most of the parts are common. The following are present but a little bit different. The vintage plastic bushings come on the parts trees. The rear arm stopper comes in the vintage parts bag. And the wheel axle, the short and long gearbox joint, is a different design than their vintage counterparts. The damper bags are nothing alike. The only parts that are the same are the large springs and piston rods. Everything else present are labeled as the same parts, but the dampers are a completely different design, so all the parts vary between the vintage and the re-release. The differential bag gear is a bit hard to tell since on the vintage side they are inside the blister pack, so I can't inspect both sides of the gears. They appear to be the same. Both the vintage and re-release have the RCC, the Frog text on the differential spur gear. I can't see if the vintage spur gears also have that text, but I would assume they would. The re-release also have the 49T, 50T, and 52T stamped on those gears, but I can't see if those are present on the vintage gears. So next up are the tires. The tires are a problem when it comes to determining which version they belong to. My vintage tires have some mold release, which is common. That is absent from the re-release, but the design and lettering on all tires are the same. The re-release tires definitely had extra fluff on the inside opening of the tires that was not present on the vintage, but I'm not sure if that would be a consistent manufacturing trait on all re-releases. So the tires are one part to be aware of if you think you are buying vintage tires. There isn't really even a reason to go through the screw bags. The vintage come with the traditional folded over labels with staples, whereas the re-release has the stickers applied to a sealed bag. On top of that, there are screws that have different colors, and also each bag has some different contents. Some of the highlights are in the A bag, the vintage has 2mm washers, while the re-release has 14mm step screws. In the B bag, the vintage has 15 and 27mm machine screws and 8mm cap screws, while the re-release has 10mm cap screws and 25 and 30mm machine screws. In the C bag, the vintage has 2x4mm screws, 16mm spacers, and 3mm nuts, while the re-release has 4mm washers, 3mm spring washers, and 2x6mm screws. Finally, in the D bag, the vintage has body mounts, while the re-release has 3x15mm tapping screws. I was pleasantly surprised that there are differences on the Frog to be able to tell the vintage body shell from the re-release. The shape itself is the same, but if it has not been cut out, you can see some differences. The re-release shell has rounded corners and also a 5841 with 1983 Tamiya stamp on the lip. The vintage shell has no markings and has square corners. Likewise, on the body wing, there are differences. The re-release wing has 5841 stamped on the lip, whereas the vintage does not. Also, the corners on the re-release are much more rounded than the vintage. Like the screw bags, the decals are very different. First up, every one of the sponsor decals are different. The most noticeable ones are the Spotlight decals. You have KC on the vintage and Bright Light on the re-release. Also, the re-release comes with stickers for the roll bar sections of the body shell, where the vintage does not. Last up are the manuals. Again, the vintage and re-release manuals are nothing alike. The vintage has the signature blue highlights throughout, whereas the re-release does not. The covers have different action shots, and the re-release is entirely in black and white. A quick flip through the pages, the instructions are somewhat different since there are some parts differences and the usual radio servo differences between vintage and re-release. So that is it. The contents of the boxes are empty. The summary on the Frog is that the two versions are pretty different. If all you get is a quick glance, perhaps it will be harder to distinguish the two, but if you have access to the original packaging or things are still on trees, it is pretty easy to tell them apart. I really enjoy doing these vintage versus re-release videos, but they sure do take an enormous amount of time to pull together. I hope that this one on the Tamiya Frog 5841 and 58354 has been helpful. Stay tuned for more Frog videos in my vintage versus re-release series, where I will be building the re-release for you and also restoring a vintage Frog. Stay tuned for more of my exciting content, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.